Thanks. Thanks for the invite and to talk about what we're trying to do up the road, up at Addenbrooke's. I'm a neurologist and clinical academic, and I'm particularly interested in neurodegenerative diseases. Trying to answer a couple of questions, really. Firstly, can we try and understand these diseases through imaging and relating that to underlying changes in pathology and cognition? And also, can we translate some of those, what we do in research, into clinical practice? And it's perhaps the second part I'll concentrate on mostly. So rather than sort of looking for highly novel, complex measures, we're actually trying to look at perhaps some of the simpler and more robust measures. And I'll talk about a data set we're collecting and some ways that we're trying to approach this and think about it. So firstly, what most people do is look at structural MRI in brain disorders and say, well, is there a difference? So on the right here, you can see a brain without someone with Alzheimer's disease, and on the left is a healthy person. We're looking for differences between those. And I guess to give you a quick flavour of sort of one way we've approached this, and which is fairly typical of the field. We took a sort of free surfer, which you've heard about, volumes and thicknesses. We put these into a fairly simple two-layer neural network and said, can we predict the probability of Alzheimer's disease based on this? And this is work in collaboration with the computer science department with Tiago Azevedo and Pietro Leo. We trained this in a data set called ADNI, which is a large Alzheimer's disease cohort, validated it in a memory clinic data set from the US. Without going into too much detail, we found very good reliability in the ADNI data set, and in the more real-world messy data set, there was a bit of a drop-off in the accuracy, but it was still fairly good. And we took that to the UK Biobank, and using this sort of fairly simple structural changes, we could pick out people who looked like they had Alzheimer's disease from their brain scans. And those people had slightly worse cognition, in looking like people with sort of early Alzheimer's disease, and they had potentially reversible risk factors of sort of blood pressure and smoking as well. So it's a sort of, in some senses, a sort of fairly simple approach, just using structural imaging for just Alzheimer's disease. But there's a few problems and issues with this. One is that this is trained in mainly research data, so it's a bit difficult to then translate this immediately into the real world without further validation. And when we collect MRI data, there's a much richer set of data that we have available, and this only looks at diagnosis. It doesn't look at prognosis, what's going to happen to people in years to come, and that's really a more pressing clinical question. So to try and answer this in a sort of real-world setting, we set up this study called Quantitative MRI in NHS memory clinics, and what I really aim to try and get to is to be able to take someone in the scanner, perform some kind of AI machine learning algorithm, and feed that information back to clinicians to be able to make decisions. Now we're some way from completing that task, but I'll show you some of the ways we're sort of trying to approach it. Now the important thing about this data set is it's unselective. Rather than research data sets where you exclude people based on their age, on their comorbidities, on the severity of their disease, anyone who walks through a memory clinic is eligible for this study, whether they have dementia or not. And we've tried to make it easy for sites to recruit, and that's important when we're trying to recruit from busy community-based memory services where most people will go, rather than in gold-plated academic centres where you've got dedicated nurses to recruit patients. So, and the aim really is to try and integrate this into clinical practice as far as possible. So we're getting as much real-world data as we can. Roughly what happens is people come for their clinic visit, they have an MRI scan, we take some simple demographics and their cognitive testing, and we take that into what's called a safe haven, where we can hold secure data, and then onto the HPC to do a bit of analysis. Um, we're collecting T1, T2 flare, susceptibility-weighted imaging, diffusion and functional MRI. The DTI and fMRI isn't available at all centres, but where we can, we do that. And we've got a mixture of scanners and a mixture of strengths of scanners. So Tanvi's talk is very relevant to our work, and I'm sure we'll find some more slight differences than is within CAM-CAM, but we're sort of starting to investigate that. So before we get to sort of developing this into sort of machine learning models and things like that, I've sort of set my lab group the challenge really of saying, well, what can we get out of this data in terms of features that we can take forward for machine learning and AI algorithms? And I'll give you a couple of examples of how we're sort of trying to do that in a minute. So we've got now 1,100, or just near 1,200 people recruited. We just opened up at 11 sites now. We're opening in Essex as well. It's sort of been a steady increase in the number of patients recruited. The nice thing about this is we've managed to convince the NHS that these scans are part of routine clinical practice. So we get the scans for free, basically. So it's free data, very much integrated into real-world memory clinics. So the task I set Tanya, one of my students, is we've got this white matter change. You've heard from Peter about the various white matter changes. This is going to be a little bit more simple, a bit more sort of with a sort of clinical hat on, really. And one of the ways that we look at these white matter changes, we're basically looking for fluffy white stuff on the scans, and we have this scale called the Physicus scale. And this is a manual scale, so we look at it and we look at, firstly, how much white matter there is, and then how confluent the white matter is. So are the dots joining together? So at the top here, we've got a few dots of white matter disease scattered around. Here, these are starting to join together a little bit, and there's a bit more volume. And at the bottom, you've got these confluent white matter hyperintensity stretching from sort of front to the back of the brain. So this is every radiologist in country will be very familiar with this. Now, if you do apply some white matter segmentation techniques, they'll quite readily give you the volumes, a number of these white matter volumes, but white matter hyperintensities, but they won't give you this measure of confluence. So that's what the segmentation algorithms will give you. We've used Bianca with FSL to get these kind of results. So Tanya had a chat to a mathematician and said, oh, well, this is a sort of problem we come across in astrophysics with stars and things like that. So we've sort of nicked some of their algorithms. I would love to pretend that I know exactly what these equations refer to. Basically, we can look at the slice and define a confluence score. So to sort of give you a visual representation of this, basically we look at each white matter hyperintensity, and then or each voxel, and look at not only the intensity of that voxel, but what is its relationship to all the voxels around it. So basically looking at the white matter hyperintensities and then saying, is the white matter in between them normal or not, over a sort of Gaussian sort of distribution around the center of that voxel. So that gives us a confluence score. This is done on a 2D level. We did actually adapt the algorithm to look at in three dimensions, which is computationally much more intensive and actually didn't improve any of the results or changes that we found. So we're stuck with using a two-dimensional approach. If you look at this in relation to correlation with age, there's a sort of slight correlation, but also, excitingly, it correlates well with the fluency scores on the Adam-Brooks cognitive examination and with overall cognition as well. So this is reflecting what we'd expect it to reflect in our data sets. It does correlate fairly well with the original Physicus score that we've calculated, so that you see those are the three rather large groups increase with this as the confidence score increases. And we've got some collaborators in Germany who have the DZNE data set, which is another sort of neurodegenerative disease data set. and they find exactly the same results as we do. So we've been able to validate this. So that's the total Addenbrooke's cognitive examination result, and there's the correlation with fluency. And fluency is a good measure of sort of processing speed and executive function, which is what we'd expect to change with white matter disease. So that's one of the examples of how we're using data. So to switch slightly, we're also interested in understanding understanding mechanisms from some of this imaging as well. David, who's sat over there, set him the question of looking at a disease called progressive supranuclear palsy. And these patients present with what are sort of termed frontal symptoms. So they're disinhibited, they think in quite sort of black and white way, often sort of lose their understanding of nuance and struggle to recognise emotions. So these are all what would classically be termed frontal symptoms, but actually there's not much atrophy in the frontal lobe. Can we investigate this in a different way and find out what's going on? So we took patients from 2 different cohorts, from a local Cambridge Centre for Parkinson's Plus cohort and from a national prospect cohort with PSP. They're fairly well matched. David looked at the functional imaging, looked at hidden Markov models. So we've heard a bit, I know you've heard a lot about functional imaging today, and you can either look at that in terms of static connectivity, where you look across a whole time series and see which bits correlate with each other. But actually that doesn't necessarily reflect the brain state, and the brain sort of cycles through these different states, if you like, and we can recover those states with using hidden Markov models. So these are the different states that David found, and we can look at how some of those states differ between our PSP patients and controls. So how long people stay in certain states. And what we found was that people are spending more time in frontal executive networks. So it's almost like these networks are sort of overworking, and that was associated with worse disease severity using this PSP rating scale. So we've got a connection here between the dynamic connectivity, sort of spending longer in these frontal executive networks, and disease severity. But interestingly, this these changes in these frontal networks weren't related to frontal atrophy, but related to subcortical atrophy. So now what we're seeing is actually subcortical changes are driving changes in frontal networks, which is having an impact on this disease and causing these, what we might term frontal, but certainly dysexecutive cognitive changes. So that's just a sort of quick flavour of what we're doing. We're working on some other things. So we're working on FreeSurfer and FastSurfer in structural MRI. We're also starting to look at cortical complexity. We're collecting some SWI imaging and just beginning to look at that. So looking at DTI and trying to extract features from that. We talked a bit about some of the graph measures. In the PSP group, we started to look at naturalistic stimuli with sort of videos to try and get into that executive dysfunction in a bit more detail, rather than with resting state, which we've done in the past. And then we're starting to combine MRI modalities, particularly in our PSP and those groups. So we're combining that with those from neuropathology and genetics. And we're also looking at machine learning approaches to combine different MRI modalities as well. So if you're interested in working with our memory clinic dataset, you're absolutely welcome to. It's freely available. We'll be very happy to facilitate that. I've got a postdoc position, which is will be advertised shortly to look at this data as well. So please come and talk to me about that. Here's a wonderful lab group who've contributed to this fantastic work. Thank you.